Hello, everybody. I'm Patrick. This is Ashley, joining you from Illinois. We have Trace Pro joining us from Georgia. It's a great day to be optimistic. And our guest today from Wisconsin, Josh Heling, Twitter homestead philosopher, chicken, duck, and turkey autodidact expert. He will send you black garlic in the U.S. mail, and I won't forget to put roses on your grave. That's a reference for, I don't know if anybody's going to get that one. That's a Rolling Stone song. So welcome, Josh.
Not the black garlic part.
No, that's
right.
dead flowers. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the talk today. Once again, like usual, I got to go take care of the kids. So anything before we get started?
No, thanks, Patrick.
All right, Trace, thanks for being here.
Patrick.
Josh, thanks for being here as well. Let's get the show on the road.
Cool.
Wonderful.
All right.
So I'll just start by saying that I really like Josh as our first guest because I think I said something along the lines of I want to be true to my idea of talking to people who do real things and not just kind of like being like every other podcast and having every other guest that every other podcast has in like a infinite circle of podcasts. And so I said, Josh, I think I would like as the first guest to be someone I could pluck from obscurity. And Josh said something along the lines of I'm obscure and pluckable.
It's true.
Yeah, so let's just start by having you introduce yourself. I guess it's hard to introduce oneself, but with
It is.
Yeah, in the narrow confines of like, what do you do for real work, and
Sure.
what do you do on the farm?
Sure. So I spend my days in the software product development world. I've been working in that space for almost 30 years now. I'm a long way from like actually getting to do useful things like write code. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm in sort of management and leadership roles, broadly interfacing the business or the other sort of driving function that wants to do things with software and the teams that actually produce it. So that's how I spend my days. But I think probably is not of a ton of interest for our conversation today. I spend my mornings and my evenings and my weekends on our small, I don't know how you describe it. I mean, small farm, homestead life, right? So we live on about 13 acres in the Dane County, Wisconsin area. Dane County is home to Madison, where we raise a variety of poultry and Icelandic sheep. That's kind of the core parts of the operation. So when I say poultry, that's laying chickens, meat chickens, turkeys, ducks, I suppose technically are poultry, but they're not really, they're more a tacked on part of the operation here than they are a focus, and the sheep. We also have some other tacked on animal groups like some bunnies that we raise for our own meat, some goats we use for clearing land, some pigs we're sort of trying to feel our way around in terms of how they might fit into the system here.
And you do sell some products.
We do, absolutely. So yeah, we're someplace on the continuum between small farm and homestead.
Okay.
So we sell direct retail. We have just in the last couple of months started going to one of the smaller farmers markets in the area, where we're selling. At the moment, we're sort of sold out of lamb, so we're selling chicken, and my wife's been canning a lot of stuff that's actually been selling remarkably well. And yeah, so we have a nice standing set of egg customers who are sort of from a business point of view, kind of the lead into everything else. So we sell eggs, and then the people who buy eggs from us, almost all of our egg sales are kind of recurring. So somebody will buy 2 dozen every week or 4 dozen every 2 weeks or whatever it is. And then that same customer base comes out when it's time to buy turkeys at Thanksgiving, or when we have a new batch of meat chickens that are ready, or there are some lamb shoulders back from the processor.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we do it.
I was this question just emerged for me, but I never called anything that I do, which I guess for people who don't know, I have land in Uruguay and I have 9 acres, chickens. I did have cows before I came to the US. I'll get cows again, fruit trees, nut trees. I never called it homesteading really until I got on Twitter. I felt weird about the word. I don't know. Do you have any feelings about the word homesteading? I just feel like
Absolutely.
it's like I feel self-conscious saying it. Whenever anyone would ask me, I'd be like, we're just, living our life on land and seeing if we can produce some food. Like that's the way I always put it. I don't
Totally.
know about you.
Yeah, I know. I totally hear you. I think all of the words are fraught to me, and sort of where I end up with that is so screw it. I'm just going to use them and I'll define them in context where it's helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, all we're doing with any words is trying to communicate something to somebody. It's never perfect. So for me, homesteading implies a great deal more sort of distance and removal from society than I think we have here. Like, I can only see a neighbor's house in one season of the year, but I can hear their lawnmowers and I can pick which Target parking lot I want to be in 15 minutes, right? Like we're not, Little House on the Prairie by any stretch of the imagination. And when I think homestead, I think of some of that stuff, right? We import plenty of things. I mean, we make a really conscious effort to be importing them from short supply chains that are relatively local, but there's no sense in which we are, I think a really problematic and not helpful definition of self-sufficient, right? Where we can just exist as this isolated bubble. That's not the deal at all.
Right. Yeah, we'll probably get into that more, but I also think I use homesteading now on Twitter as like a shorthand for people who are landed in some way, who are trying to produce for themselves or for sale. Like in the context of Twitter where people are using it, we know what it's referring to. It's a general constellation or whatever, and it's fine. But it's just so funny because I never would have probably used that word myself until other people were using it, and I know it's referring to other things. Anyways, okay, so let's do a brief how did you get into farming story.
Sure.
You didn't have any real agricultural background growing up?
I didn't even have any fake agricultural background growing up. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, but in the suburbs of the Milwaukee area. I mean, I couldn't have been more useless in terms of direct hands-on production of the necessities of life. My wife and I both grew up in the suburbs. We both sort of followed the typical, middle class, upper middle class kind of trajectory. We went to college, we got white collar, oriented educations. I went and pursued a career that was very much an indoor person's, career. And we had sort of always had this notion very loosely defined in the back of our heads that someday when we were old and gray, grayer, and we were having these thoughts a while ago. So, give me some slack. That we would retire to a place in the country. And when our kids were, I think like 10 and 7, probably it started when they were like 9 and 6, we just kind of had this realization, like, what do we really want to wait? Like, if we wait, then we're going to be old and it's not going to be a part of their lives at all. And so that led to us taking a couple of Saturdays or Sundays, about a decade ago, and looking at some properties for sale in the country. And I mean, the short version is we just sort of fell in love with the idea of getting some more space and getting hands-on. I mean, I'm a hands-on learner, very much. Food is, I think, really important, and its importance is understated culturally, sort of emotionally, economically. It's all kinds of messed up. And our desire was to disintermediate some of that for ourselves, at least.
Yeah.
So we moved into the country really with no plan to speak of. Like, we didn't. Our plan was that we wanted to have some space so that we could dive into some sort of agricultural activities. There's probably a really good and valid, critique of our approach from like a rationalist point of view. But I don't. Like, it worked out fine. It worked out great. We looked at a few places.
What would a rationalist critique be, do you think?
I mean, we didn't even have an objective, much less a plan, right? We didn't, like, how do you, I mean, I think the rationalist critique would be that, there was no method at all. You couldn't say our method was unsound, our method was absent. We were following, maybe we had like an aesthetic Northern Star would be the way to put it.
Okay.
And that's going to bite or expose me to plenty of cottagecore criticism. I think you were maybe the first one to level that on Twitter, and it's fair, and the ducks are cute, but Our motive was to sort of transplant ourselves and our energies, to take our slack time and put it toward something more directly related to our sustenance. And the rest.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the rest was details. And I guess in defense of our lack of a plan, that's why we didn't care. I mean, honestly, like it was sort of critical for us that we could, still get our kids to school, that we would stay involved in the social world we were in, that we could keep our jobs, which meant connectivity, right? So those things created a lot of constraints. We knew those things. We didn't know, what kind of land we would need for a cattle operation versus sheep versus, greenhouse gardening. And we didn't care, which is why we let those other constraints sort of drive. Then we got here and started to sort of orient, here being the property we ended up buying, and sort of started to orient and to learn what was possible and what was a good fit here.
Right. Okay, so a comment and a question. The comment is, my critique of cottagecore is that I think the aesthetic part of it is great. What I would like to see more of is the grungy side, which I think is like the most of it, most of the landed stuff is very grungy and interesting, much more interesting than like the perfectly assembled apple bowl or whatever, you know what I mean? So I think like the grungy stuff is cool. It also shows you so much more like about what it is about this existence that's appealing, the grungy side. So that's my critique. I just think like go for the aesthetics, it's fine, but the aesthetic should include whatever, some kind of the gross side, and then the junk pile. We had this whole conversation about.
Yes, we had our junk pile off. Mine has gotten much bigger since then. I actually almost dug that thread up to a pen because I cleaned out a chicken coop that was desperately overdue for it, and like this really surprising volume of material, like wood and very, like I don't even know how I haven't got in there. Obviously, I had put it all in, but yeah, so now the pile's really big. But, no, I think that cottagecore critique is right on. I mean, look, I have very little patience for like the Pinterests of the world because they're sizzle, generally speaking, without steak, and that's not interesting to me.
Totally. And then the question I have for you is, did you have any like aha moment that you can think of that really like made you think about the juxtaposition between like indoor city life, white collar life versus this other thing?
You mean like around sort of the time when we made the decisions to make this change?
Like
that's an interesting question, and I don't think there's a moment, but I think there is probably a trajectory that follows. I've had a soft spot for like sort of near future dystopian speculative fiction for as long as I've been reading, and I think really the thing that appeals to me is that these imagined futures where it is not all working out resonate, because it is clear to me, and it has been clear to me for my entire adult life, really, that it is not all working out, right? The system will not hold. The wheels are very certainly coming off the axis. Now, huge uncertainties about, timescale and nature and distribution of that, collapse, I suppose, right? It might be 100 years, it might be 500 years, it might be 3 years, it might be fairly evenly distributed. I think an interesting thing that I've thought about a lot lately is that I think it is to a large extent already here, and in fact that I speak about it as a future thing still is just a reflection of a privileged position. It is not so much in my face day to day, but I think it is absolutely here. But anyway, so there had been sort of this this element of the Josh arc forever that involved an interest in that, and the moment that is clear to me as an inflection point is not so much around our decision to move to the country, but a couple of years earlier, as 2008 started this shakedown. And what I think became really clear to me, and lots of other people, I promise I have no unique insights about anything, was that it was it being the system broadly, like in particular high finance and the rest of our day-to-day worlds, at least in the relatively economically comfortable north that derive from global finance, is a shell game, right? I mean, it is not it doesn't all line up. And we saw that really clearly in 2008. I think we saw a little bit of it starting COVID, and we're seeing a long tail of it kind of continuing out through supply chain issues and what have you. In 2008, we had just like when that really started to, when that crisis really kicked into its sort of final high gear, we had literally just closed on a new house like 2 weeks before. So it was kind of a terrifying time to be, in a little bit of financial, adjustment personally. And our response, we lived in a cool old house in a near-in neighborhood in Madison, was to buy a chest freezer. We bought a 13 cubic foot chest freezer. And I remember like going down to the basement and thinking, okay, well, A, I guess I feel more comfortable than I did yesterday. And B, who am I kidding? Like, what is this, it's this little freezer. Like, sure, I can have a couple of chickens and a roast. Like, this doesn't really move the needle, right? On where our, existence depends on all of these big, long, complicated, and I think largely not trustworthy dependency chains. So it took a while, right? I think it's weird to acknowledge the degree of exposure and dependence that we all live with it, which I think has a lot to do with how the forthcoming collapse is generally perceived by people, right? I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance to acknowledging what's right before us because it's so scary and we don't know what to do with that.
Totally. You know what? I'm wondering. We've never really talked about this much, but like, what was your psychological journey like through doomerism, and doomerism being like this thing where you're recognizing, oh my gosh, like this is so precarious, this world, like there's so many things that could go wrong. Like the more you dig into it, the more you're fragile you see the systems are. And then being like, oh my gosh, that's super scary. And also I'm very sad about it, which is the doomerism thing. And then the optimism thing for me is just like, okay, I've processed this. It's almost like the stages of grief now, like acceptance. And then next, what's next? Do I just sit here like unable to do anything because I'm so angry and depressed? Or do I like move towards something? And so that's, that was my trajectory. Did you have a similar movement toward something positive? Or
it's interesting. I was thinking about this when I was listening to your first episode, when you talked a fair bit about sort of the origin of Doomer Optimism, and I guess maybe talked about not defining it, which I think is a fantastic idea. I mean, to me, it's really simple, right? And I think it's funny, as I was listening, I was thinking the tent can only be very big, I think, when you have properly not defined, but allowed a connotative, umbrella to fall out of the term Doomer Optimism. It has to be a big tent, because I think, to me, you take it apart and it really just means two things. The Doomer side means you are like honestly perceiving what's happening. It's not difficult. It's not tricky. It's not subtle. Like there's no question. You can pick your flavor, maybe, right? You could be a fossil fuel oriented doomer or a climate oriented doomer or whatever. I mean, politics, pick it. It doesn't matter. I would probably choose E, all of the above myself. So there's that. And I think, everybody's there if they're being honest. And then the optimism part, like, what the hell else are you going to do? Like, what's the alternative, right? So really, I think all a doomer optimist is someone who is understanding any portion of the reality of where we sit as a society, and continues to be, right? And wakes up and has another day. Because I don't understand nihilism. I don't understand a sort of fatalism. If only because what a horrible existence, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
what motivates you to move forward or toward anything, Right. Yeah, that to me is like, and I think a lot of people are stuck in that. And the real goal for me here and this is to give people options, to give them the idea that there are options out there, that you don't have to be like so paralyzed by fear or anger, that there are other things. So on that note, okay, one of the people in the world who I feel like OG Doomer Optimist, because he's so specific on potential things to engage in, is Mark Shepard. He's written this book called Restoration Agriculture. He like takes permaculture principles, but he kind of critiques the permaculture movement as like herb spirals. And he's like, okay, let's take permaculture principles and then bring them to like actual agricultural production. I'm wondering how you came across Mark Shepard. I know you've you've met him before, he's from Wisconsin, like, then Mark, I would just say to people listening that Mark Shepard, then a lot of people are very inspired by his vision for the future of agriculture. And he's got like a whole bunch of acolytes who are doing things like basically reversing desertification and building soil and sequestering carbon while producing food, like all this amazing stuff in different places around the world. So yeah, just tell me a little bit, like, who is Mark Shepard and why should we care who he is?
Sure. I mean, I think you gave a great introduction to him, and I think you know, your positioning of him vis-a-vis permaculture, I think is right on, and he does a great job. If anyone's curious and like diving a little bit deeper on that topic, there is Dakota Cohen is another ag scale permaculturalist who has very good content, YouTube and a podcast. And well, I think it was one of his podcast episodes where he interviewed Mark, and they got to talking about that, and it's a great conversation. I mean, I think. I mean, I don't know Mark personally, right? I've been to his farm, taken a tour, been to a couple of events that he's presented at. That's the extent of it. He's a person with strong opinions, who I think, from my perspective, has earned them, right? His place is, I want to say 100, maybe 120 acres, a couple of hours from here, and it's, by my recollection, maybe 30 years into existence, and it's just a sight to behold. I mean, it's really remarkable, the integration of nuts and fruits, and a little bit of annual agriculture, and a lot of very clearly permaculture-inspired infrastructure and systems for animal agriculture, and then yield taking from perennials. So that's what he's done, and largely using, or at least in a way that's compatible with permaculture principles. And I think the criticism of permaculture more as a fashion, or as a lifestyle dimension, is that it is of a scale, when it is in a backyard, it is of a scale that is of little consequence. I'm attempting to paraphrase the conversation that he and Dakota Cohen had, and I think that's fair, and I think that's also not a knock on it, right? And certainly I don't intend it, and I don't think it's valid as a knock on its practitioners. I mean, permaculture is a wonderful scaffolding. It's a design principle at the end of the day, and it's great as a design principle. Or what are the things you should think about? It is by its nature recontextualizable. So if your context is a 1/10 of an acre backyard plot, cool, it can fit there. I think the observation from people like Mark and Dakota is that's great, but it just doesn't move any needles very much. Mm-hmm. And at their scales, 3 digits of acres, it can. And it is there was a Twitter conversation last week that involved somebody saying, now that I have grazing animals, I just don't, if I drive around town, I don't look at the empty space the same way. I see it all as potential. And I think that's true, and that's really exciting. And I'm so grateful to people like Mark and Dakota for, defining how that vision or showing rather how that vision can be applied to spaces like that. The scale of transformation that I would argue we need for like the United States food system is really daunting. It's an enormous thing. So having referenceable pilot projects or blueprints that demonstrate how things can be useful and productive and a lot more aligned with ecological systems at that kind of scale is a critical thing, I hope, for this century. I mean, it's that, or it's going to be a lot worse.
Yeah, my counter argument to the scale is too small for regular permaculture is just like, I don't know, I think about places I've been, like rural Italy, and everyone has chickens and everyone has a garden, and like that kind of culture is something that does move the scale. Like the culture of small scale production, like tiny scale production.
Totally.
That culture of self-production does move the scale. But then they're asking a question, like a totally different question, which is like, what should agricultural producers be doing? So it's like both and to me for those things.
I think that's absolutely right, which is why, like, I understand their criticism. I think it's valid in a sense, but I actually find, and I think I said this not too long ago in some of the thread, I credit you with the distillation of getting someone to like do a thing, specifically
Just
in this context, to
anything.
produce a thing of food. I don't care what it is. And I agree. I think that's the key inflection point, and to take people over that line, whether it's in, what I would call the homestead context, where it's for yourself, or the small farm context, where it's for commercial sale. I don't think it really matters. It is walking over that line from just taking and needing and depending to producing and creating.
Right. And so
that's the thing that matters.
Yeah. And moving from consumption to production, like to me, that's such a huge part of what one could move toward. It doesn't even need to be food. It could also be like Chelsea Norman, like, I'm going to stop buying yogurt. I'm just going to start making yogurt at home. And that's one less thing I'm dependent on. I can just get the milk, and then I can make yogurt myself. It could be like needlepoint. It could be like learning how to sew your own clothes. Like it could be share, whatever. Which now makes me think of this Portlandia sketch where Fred Armisen is like this cool guy who makes furniture. And at the end of the sketch, you see he like puts his foot on the stool and it like can barely hold him. It's called he's making furniture now, is like this cool thing, because like they make fun of it. They do such a really good job with that, because I do think like what's also very funny about the production stuff, the culture that's coming around it, is like all of us, a lot of us are so inept. And it's okay that we're inept. Like, just get on the journey. Like, that's part of my critique of the cottagecore thing too, is like when we first got our chickens, we didn't get them into the coop right away. So the whole day we just spent chasing them and like realizing that chickens are just faster than humans. And it was so like embarrassing, but like, I don't know. It's just, I think it's important to acknowledge like how little we all know. And if you take the step into production, that it's like, it's okay if you feel silly or are doing it badly. It's also okay to make fun of yourself,
Yeah. I mean, I think the key thing that happens is you establish agency by trying, right? You don't have to do it by succeeding. One of the things I've most enjoyed doing, I spent a number of years coaching a youth Lego robotics team. So, I mean, I got into this because my kids were interested, and it kind of fit with my professional background. And so, I'd coach these little groups of like 4th through 8th graders, and they would come in, basically knowing nothing, and they would build these little Lego based robots, and they would go out and do things. And, it was really common. I would have a conversation like with their parents where they were all excited because the kids were learning STEM skills. And it's like, I don't, like none of these kids are like, I know your kids. I mean, obviously you know them too, but like, they're not going to go be, and I hope they're not engineers. They're like really creative and smart. But what I want them to know, like the critical lesson to me is that you have control over the technology, right? That's it. Like, that's the only point. And by analogy, I think the same is true of your foods and your fibers and like all of the stuff that you need to live. You don't have to produce it. You have to see yourself as somebody who could conceivably do those things. Right. Even if you couldn't practically speaking do them, like just understanding that they're not mana from the global, corporate capitalist heaven, that they are in fact just things that, our grandparents made. That's a huge change of mindset.
I think, and just like, empowering people, giving them the sense of agency, like, and not to discount the struggles and the structures that make it hard for people to do X, Y, or Z, but just, I guess giving people a template for what's possible. I think like that's to me the goal. Okay, so quickly back to Mark Shepard. One of the things he talks about, and another guy who I really like who I've found a couple of his YouTube videos, who's also from Wisconsin, Peter Allen of Mastodon Valley Farms, talks about, is the oak savanna ecosystem. And I think what's really cool about this, at least from the what I get from it, and I'm not an ecologist, but this is my mental model of this oak savanna ecosystem. Basically, like, humans can be a keystone species in an ecosystem. For example, in a lot of the Great Plains in the United States, lots of Native American tribes were doing planned burns to keep a savanna ecosystem going so that the bison population would stay large enough that they could hunt them. And then on the edges of these savanna ecosystems, there were like these forest gardens where they purposefully planted trees that were fruit and nut trees like nearby their settlements. So it was almost like a garden, a wild garden. And so the idea here being like humans can be a keystone species working together with other creatures, building an ecosystem that functions with them in it. And we could mimic that with like with plants, with permaculture, with trees and animals, and we can mimic basically like a domesticated sort of wild forest garden, but it just now a domesticated version of it. I think that's super cool. You and I have never talked about this. Is that the reason you're shooting for oak savanna too?
Well, it is, and thank you for bringing us back to the question. We kind of rambled away. Yeah, so I encountered, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to move to the country, and we were going to sort out the details afterwards. So when we got here, the here that we acquired, that our house is on, is, like I said, about 13 acres. About 11 of it is a former oak savanna, and we know this because we've managed to dig up aerial photos from, I think, probably the first aerial photography pass, like in the 30s, and you can see, I can look at those. I'm a map-oriented spatial thinker, so I know the map of our land very well from a lot of different perspectives. I can see the same trees, right? Like they were big in the 30s, and they're big now. The difference, though, is remarkable. In the 30s, there were, I don't know, 80 trees that you would see from the aerial, and today, or 10 years ago, even more so, it's just a sea of green, like it's all tree canopy. And the understory was all, when we got here, basically all invasives and brambles of different kinds.
Right.
A lot of the sort of mid-story was, not the like nice, desirable hardwoods, but various sort of opportunistic junk. And it was almost impassable. So this is the context we were in when we got here. We had chickens were our gateway drug. We had 4 chickens in the city, and that certainly was a huge part of us deciding that we wanted to do this. We like to joke that it was, if Madison had allowed us to have more than 4 chickens, maybe this would have all gone very differently. But we got to 4, and we're like, no, chickens are way too cool. We can't just have 4. So we got here, and we knew, like, okay, we can have a lot more chickens. The garden can be a whole lot bigger. We have a very big garden. We have some fruit trees and so forth, but then the question was, well, what do we do with the rest? And I honestly don't remember how I came across Mark Shepard, but I remember sitting on the hammock reading Restoration Agriculture and realizing, like, oh, the kind of system that he's talking about, we're like sitting on the overgrown, weirdly decayed bones of exactly that. And so in the end, this is the farm is named Hidden Savanna Farm because we see our objective is really, kind of like a sculptor with the block of granite. We're removing the other stuff to let that other, that thing that is inside come through. And that is a heck of a lot of work, but
yeah. And I think this is different from a lot of people who think about nature as this pristine thing that humans should be out of. And if we just all removed all humans, then it would go back to this like perfect pristine state.
Sure.
But if you look to see like your property, it is just like a bunch of bramble and like small bushes underneath. If there's no, like a lot of the animals that were once in the ecosystem in which you live, like have become extinct. And so now the ecosystem is different without them or whatever. And I think, it's just like there's a couple of different worldviews for like how to approach what is natural. Can humans be involved in it at all? That kind of thing.
That's a great topic, and I mean, yeah, it's oftentimes comes up in the veganism versus animal ag discussions on Twitter. But the idea that we can high tech produce all of our food and then rewild everything else. Just sort of wall it off and let it be, and that would be best for the planet. I mean, I think there is a coherent argument there. I don't subscribe to it personally, but I think there's a valid argument, and I certainly think that the people, generally speaking, who make it are well intentioned.
Yeah.
However, where I sort of philosophically can't align there is that view requires first seeing humans as not part of the ecosystem, which just doesn't make any sense. You put it well, a lot of the species are gone, like things change. We are certainly a part of that change, but I think that the intellectually responsible thing to do with the knowledge that we're part of that change is not just to flagellate ourselves for having broken everything, but to own the fact that we are in fact a participant in this system and not, its engineer. And things like the vision that Mark and Peter Allen and others articulate, I think are a great example of how we can do that.
Yeah.
And that is, they are the giants at whose ankles we bite here, right? Like that's, so our objective is to kind of move in that direction at our very small scale.
Yeah. And I think like, I mean, I saw something recently about these forest fires that constantly are happening in the West, and somebody was showing how they mechanically cleared all this underbrush. And then when the fire reached this underbrush cleared area, it stopped spreading. And I was like, well, what? There are goats, like goats do that. You don't need to have a mechanical like fossil fuel run thing. And then I posted that, like, maybe you could just toss some livestock in there and then, I don't know, win-win. Then you also get some like food out of it. And then a bunch of people were posting like examples of how that like principle works. So I just think like, I don't know, a lot of times you just think livestock, the way that we approach it is based on global aggregate data of industrial farming. And we're not thinking holistically about it, but I've talked about that so many times, I don't need to keep going about that. But okay, related question to this, how do you approach this farming, the farming stuff in general? We've talked a lot about this, like you didn't go in with a plan, the rationalist might critique that, but the counter argument, and one I know Joe Norman makes, and I know Nassim Taleb makes, is how to approach things, in iterations, complex systems. And your farm is a complex system. For those listening, I've visited Josh's farm. It's like the amount of information he has to hold in his head, like, because the animals are all moving with electric fencing through the landscape over time. And then the landscape itself is changing as a result of the animals moving through it. And then clearing the brush, for example. And then Josh has to like think, is it time to move them? What was this like this time last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago? Has to like hold that all in his head to like make decisions about the next step. So I'm just wondering if you could talk through like what that approach is like.
Sure. It's funny. I had a recent reminder of the complexity of the system. We left for 2 days recently. Our eldest is starting to look at colleges, and so we needed to go visit some. And it was the first time we'd left at all, any of us, since 2019. And so, with someone watching the farm, but I had to write out, like obviously I simplify everything. We were only gone for 2 days, so I had, no animal groups moved while we were gone. It was just like feed things, close them at night, let them out in the morning. Here's how to check water. But it was 4 or 5 pages of like single spaced, and it was my dad who was watching it, so I had a very high level of trust in both his capabilities and his diligence. But still, it's a lot of stuff. I think I love the way that Joe articulates the realities of complexity. They've really, it's helped me to see more clearly some stuff that I think in my professional life I'd come to learn and to sort of intuit, in terms of an approach. And obviously the sort of intellectual framework is a nice shortcut for that. And it makes it easier to cross apply to other domains. I'm not at all, big plans, thinking now, switching to sort of the way that I would do this in my day-to-day life, in software. Big plans fail, like, just period. They do, and it's not because they're the teams implementing them are bad. It's not because the plan was bad. It's because the idea of planning, 50 person months of work is predicated on arrogance and it's not realistic to think that one can put that amount of uncertainty, that number of variables into a plan and have a coherent thing come out. In the software world, we see that turn into an endless search for agility, a fashion towards the artifacts of agility and the trappings of it. Sometimes that's real, oftentimes that's not. which is why it continues to largely disappoint. But here, it works the same way. I think, to me, you look as short as you can, or rather, there's a relationship between depth of view, how far forward are you looking, and degree of expected specificity / confidence you put in the answers. So I might have a 5-year plan, but I'm going to have a very low degree of specificity on my 5-year plan, and an even lower degree of confidence that my plan will play out like that. Right. This is the fun. It's fun to tease Joe about visions. I don't know. We shouldn't get into that. But the point is, I think you can have a vision if it's fuzzy. So, sorry.
I said, get into it. Get into it. Why?
Well, I mean, I think it seems wrong to put words in Joe's mouth here, but I think the key is that a vision can be ambiguous. It can be vague. It can be fuzzy, and it can still provide value. So when I look at a longer term plan, that's how I look. Right. So in 10 years, I know that there's, 4 or 5 acres that is currently still invasives and bramble that I want to be grazable, that I want to have perennial fruit and nut production to a greater degree in, that I want to figure out water distribution to. That's maybe all that I could say about it. Is
still a question mark. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How am I going to get there? I don't know, because that's actually not what I'm doing today. Like what I was doing today was, the sheep decided that they were done with the very large area I gave them to graze before I left town. So this morning I got a new one ready, so that tomorrow probably I can move them into it. And of course, that's all, a sliding scale, right? There's a middle term that's in between there. And as you go through those shorter term cycles, you're inevitably, a couple of things are happening. You're learning primarily about like mechanics and their results. And then the environment's changing, right? As you said, what I did last year may not work this year because the starting conditions are different. It's incredibly difficult to model those things. And in a sense, when I think back on my life, I'm kind of inclined to an unhealthy work-life balance, or at least I was when I was younger. And so like maybe a decade into my career, I was just like only working, and I found myself, I looked back at one point and I realized like, oh, I'm picking hobbies in an attempt to find something that I can't mechanically reduce to something that could theoretically be solved with software. Like I want to have a thing that must be analog. And, so like that got me into cooking, that got me into bonsai, that got me into, other things that were just difficult to quantify in a satisfying way. And I think to a large extent, that's what this is, right? Like, sure, I use software to help the administrative and record keeping part of the day-to-day, but there's far too many moving pieces to encapsulate it in that, right? To let it reduce to that. So
that is like,
I've wandered pretty far from the question. I'm sorry.
that is a very hashtag resist is like, it literally pursuing things that cannot be quantified, pursuing things that can't be like controlled and taken up by pods, because you just can't, it literally can't be. That's why I'm always railing against like the can it feed the world question. It's like, you cannot aggregate this data. You can barely collect it. You can barely collect data on peasant agriculture, barely. Like, it's almost illegible what production is like, because it's constantly shifting through the seasons and through the years and whatever. I would also just add that I think that this pursuing something that cannot be quantified and modeled also forces a sort of Zen or Taoist, like live with the question, let the answer emerge kind of perspective. And I guess like on that note, what is the goal of all of this for you? I remember you telling me something about connection, but I think like, I mean, honestly, that to me, one of the goals for me is, I think pursuing something that forces me to slow down, forces me to, to answer questions in an analog way, answer questions by communing with nature and understanding, like being told signals that are, receiving signals that are not really quantifiable. Or legible, or can't be represented in data, makes you have this sort of Zen kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I hear that. I think I don't think about the goal so much as like a thing that sits out there in the future. I mean, I don't know, when we were looking at properties, we got to this one, I think it was probably this one, and our realtor looked at us and it's like, guys, there's like a lot that's not right with this place. Like it was in a pretty serious state of neglect. And I remember I was probably very strange seeming to the realtor. So I looked at him and was like, that's cool. I really don't like to be bored. And like that's kind of a lot of it. Like, I really don't like to be bored. So what is the goal? I mean, sure, the goal is that, we continue, to uncover the savanna, to turn it into, a more functioning and more independent, perennial food system. I mean, at some level, that's the goal. But when you think about goals, you oftentimes think about them as being achievable. I don't like that. That's never done. And that's okay. I mean, like, I think for me, the goal is really, it's more about how we spend our days and how we spend our lives and what it is that constitutes a day, a month, a year. I really, I'm a homebody, and I really enjoy that I am an active part of this complex system, and that it, it's weird. It's not like I want it to depend on me, but I appreciate being a component of it, and being able to do that and kind of steward it and nudge it. And it nudges me too, right? We definitely have a dynamic relationship, and try to get things that are valuable out of it. So for us, that is some of our food. And then, that is also our, quantitatively absolutely irrelevant interaction in the marketplace. And then when we do our taxes, sure, the farm is a business. It produces a non-negligible amount of revenue, but if you look at the definition of the hobby farm, it's like one that somebody is not relying on for their existence. We're certainly a hobby farm, right? But to me, the significance of that is that giving someone else some of their food, even if it's a couple of chickens a year or their Thanksgiving turkey, is profound. It is. I think the fact that we've become so distanced from both our food and the way that it's produced is weird. I don't even want to be more judgmental about it. It just doesn't feel quite right. And there are a lot of reasons why that has to be. That's not by any stretch meant to shame or blame those that are not able to do that. Our food's expensive. I think it's a problem that we expect and we need food to be cheap. But I think that the root of that problem sits not in the production of expensive food. It sits in a lot of other much broader topics. So what is the goal? I mean, I don't know. I think my goal is to continue to do this and then die. Hopefully in a long time, but it doesn't. I don't think it has more than that to it.
Yeah, and what you were talking about just now reminded me of when you were saying being needed by the land and the animals, and then you being sort of transformed by their presence in your life and vice versa. And it reminds me of parenting, where you're responsible for someone or thing. And I think in general, we want to just be like ultimate convenience. Like I can leave at any point. I have freedom then to like go about whatever I want to do, but like responsibility for a thing and a place and a person is just it's a different kind of goal than just ultimate freedom of movement and choice at all time, but super deeply meaningful, like just being sort of anything. And then you, like everyone, not to be cliche, then you get changed by raising your kids and become more mature, and it's just like this, I don't know, sort of beautiful relationship. So what is your sense of the nascent homestead, farmstead, self-sufficiency movement? Do you think there is a movement? Do you think I'm pretending there's a movement because I like it? Do you have critiques of this kind of thing? Like, this is kind of a socio-political question. I don't know, like, I really don't, I don't have any numbers. I have no real sense of like what's going on. I just have a sense that there's sort of mass panic and people are trying to think, what can I do?
It's interesting. I mean, I have a couple of different reactions to that, like isolated. I don't know if there's a movement or not. I don't have a basis to know that. I know what comes into my day-to-day sphere, but obviously where I focus my attention is as much a determinant of what's going to differently come into my day-to-day as some change in the external material reality, right? So I know that I have encountered at different times others who either think or act similarly in significant ways. And those moments are really wonderful, whether that's maybe the first at scale was probably the Midwest Renewable Energy Association, which is a fantastic group based also here in Wisconsin, hosts a fair every year that is just like one of the most, I mean, I haven't had it for the last 2 years, sadly, but really one of the most inspiring and awesome things. It's nothing fancy, but I'm just getting, seeing a bunch of other people who perceive more or less the same reality that you perceive is really inspiring and relieving in a sense. Certainly the corner of Twitter that we both reside in is similar. I mean, I've been on Twitter from the very start and have never, I think until I sort of stumbled into what you might call homesteader Twitter, was a very, occasional and not a committed Twitter user, let's say. And I didn't take a lot from it, right? I followed it primarily for news and outrage consumption. And, those things are just not satisfying really in the long run. What's been great, since I've sort of stumbled into homestead Twitter is just the community and the fact that there are others. So I don't have any idea if there's a movement. And I sort of don't care. Like it is meaningful to me that there are others who do similar things and think similar things and see similar things. It's even more meaningful to me that while, and you guys talked about this a little bit in the first episode with again in the big tent content, that there's a lot of disagreement among those people too. And that for me, especially in the last couple of months, has really clarified just how much I think the conventional framing of our current political situation is beyond useless. Like it just doesn't represent anything of significance anymore. And in a sense, that's really liberating, because I think if you look at the political discourse, it's almost impossible to come to a conclusion other than it's intractably doomed, right? That it is not discourse anymore. It is warfare. It is worse. It's warfare based on misunderstanding and misinformation, oftentimes weaponized misunderstanding and misinformation. It's really not good, and I sincerely think there is no path out to sort of reconciliation and a reclamation of civil discourse through that lens. But then I think when I look at the reality of human beings interacting, that is gone. Right, that just doesn't exist. And I think I mentioned to you, some time ago, one of my favorite things after moving to the country is, we were on quite a budget by the time we got here. We needed a whole bunch of stuff like that. We didn't even know the stuff we needed when we first arrived. And, we started to kind of figure out what we needed. And we got into the habit of going to Craigslist for most of it, because we could get it for, dimes on the dollar. And that was about our budget. And I just kind of, a few Craigslist interactions in, I realized like, absolutely everybody I've talked to that I've, bought an old hay wagon from, or picked up a couple of chickens from, or like whatever the like kind of small transaction might have been, has been a really nice person. We've had something in common. We have the immediate thing in common, right? The transaction. And then, there's more, and there's a human connection that is of significance. And, when you then like add to that the layer that is the conventional political discourse, probably in almost every case, I'm significantly at odds with these people. It's not part of our interaction, because it actually is really not real for most intents and purposes. And I love that. Like that is maybe for me, that's what starts the optimism, is this idea that the thing at the human level that makes this all seem so doomed is largely a construction. I mean, I really believe that.
Total psyop. I mean, at least for me, it's just like trying to tell us that we hate each other when we don't really. I mean, especially like when you get together with other people who are different from you, and you're collaborating on something that's not explicitly political. but something else. It could be commerce, it could be some community thing, whatever it is. It could be building something. I always think of Mash Tun Timmy and his friends making beer together, like just, you know, this stuff where you're like in the act of creation together. You're not getting together to argue about politics. Like rarely, what I mean, why are we even what's the point of that? I don't know. I think a lot of times, like people are thinking like, I can't ever agree with them. Like, just don't bring up certain topics and instead focus on these other things and create together.
Right.
Yeah.
I just won't argue with people on Twitter. Like, I just don't, you know, I've thought, you know, people run those little games where they're like, you know, reply to this and I'll tell you, you know, whatever, what tweet best represents you, or like, you know, those silly things. And the one that I've wanted to do is like, reply to this and I will think the thing I horribly disagree with you about, but I'm never going to tell you, you know, because I could do it for everybody, right?
Yeah.
But what's the point?
Right.
It's much more fun to talk about the things that we, you know, do have in common or do agree about or almost agree about. And you can, there's no reason to, like, you don't run out of that stuff, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either. And by popular request, Doomsday Parent asked us to talk about Twitter. How do you use Twitter and why? And what are your more delightful, what are the more delightful sides of Twitter for you?
I use Twitter, I would say I still use Twitter very inconsistently. It is sometimes, it's more, how do I use Twitter? I mean, sometimes I use it to fill time. I really try to limit that, honestly, because I find that sort of slides into the outrage machine usage pattern really easily.
I'm specifically referring to the fact that you post like ducks and not outrage machine.
Yeah, well, so you know, my deep long story background, in high school, I was a nationally competitive policy debater. I was very good, and is all I did. I just spent time in the library and then spent time debating. Like, didn't do school really. I mean, I did enough, but like that was my life. And I sort of burned out in my senior year and didn't pursue that in college. But and I've realized, like, as adulthood has grown on, that it really sort of set up some of how my head works in this, because like competitive policy debate is a sport. It's not like talking about issues. It's not like having a debate in the way that outsiders would. It's just a sport. So in the same way that going for a run with your friends is really different than going to a track and field event, like there's no comparison. But I spent a lot of time sort of training for that heavily adversarial mode of truth seeking. And in the worldview of policy debate, that is a noble effort. It is truth seeking, you know, kind of like a lawyer would argue, you know, I'm defending the obviously guilty person, but I'm doing it because the process of that defense, the dialectic that's created, is how we get to the best possible result. Very similar kind of idea. And it, you know, it took me a really long time to realize just how much most people have no comprehension of that as what's going on in a superficially combative discourse. And you know, that's unfortunate, right? I say that primarily because if you found people that I've worked with in the first maybe 3 decades of my life, which at this point is a while ago, you know, I was probably more of a negative influence than I would have wanted to be, and somewhat unknowingly. And I really credit my eldest kid for realizing this. They started down a similar path, and a couple of years in, they were like, "No, this is not a good thing." And they had this really brilliant and brave and well articulated insight. You know, for them, it was, "This is why I'm quitting debate." And I think they're really onto something. And I have kind of brought that into the way that I've approached social media. It's obviously a bit of an analogy, but like there's just, it comes back to finding more value in talking about the things in common, right? Than in not. I just don't, there are very few contexts in which explaining to someone why they're wrong is a useful thing to anyone.
Yeah, and I think that in general, a lot of the fights on Twitter are this middle ground, like, okay, there's either talking about things we all agree on, or we're doing like I think this, and somebody's doing yes, and I think this, and I would add this, and it's just all positive interactions. And there is what you're describing, where debate can be generative, but it has to be in good faith and not like half-assed, and also not just mean-spirited, which like just doesn't seem to exist. There's this middle ground where it's just like mean-spirited and like, I don't know, half-assed. It's not that thoughtful. People are just going with low blows, and like that to me is just it's the biggest waste of time.
Totally.
And I just like feel so gross if I ever get into those situations.
It's worse than a waste of time, right? Because it produces a lot of negativity, and I think that's real. You know, I credit a dear lifelong friend who has known me forever and knows, you know, my actually deep inner nature, in the bad way. And at one point, like, you know, sort of over years tried to get me to get this, and eventually succeeded, you know, specifically around the sort of yes and alternative to a disagreement. And I was thinking about it recently, and the analogy that really resonated for me was, I'm fascinated by the idea of picturing civilizations meeting for the first time, right? So we have this in sci-fi, you know, movies like Contact, but I think about it more easily in historical context, right? Some explorer from one culture encounters the other. What's fascinating to me is our ability cognitively to learn a language from scratch, right? So if you and I are from completely different cultures, completely different languages, we encounter each other one day, you know, 4 weeks later, we're able to communicate in some manner. Like, how? That's magic. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But what I was thinking was, there's no way that works when either party's approach to it is to correct the other one and explain to them why they're using the word for banana wrong. Right? Like, that wouldn't possibly work. The only way to make that work is, oh, that's how you see it. Okay, well, this is how I, you know, do it. And then that continues until there's enough of a shared, you know, reference space that there can be actual communication. And I think it's all, you know, sort of fractally that at different layers.
Yep, I agree. And I guess, like, to me, it's a similar thing with how I like to use Twitter, and also how I approach being an outsider toward locals in Uruguay, is just a how can I give you the greatest benefit of the doubt, to try to understand where you're coming from, to try to explain in the best way that I can where I'm coming from, so that we might learn from each other's perspectives in a way that's like, you know, illuminating, or, you know, understanding some side of the elephant or whatever. To use Cognizor's, I don't want to refer back to Jason's tweet, but people can go find it. So on that topic, both with Twitter and with local people, what you might call local people, I'm thinking of these Craigslist interactions you've had, but
sure.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because I think part of the thing that people are really afraid of, or not afraid of, but critique, like homesteady self-production stuff, because they're like, this is just neoliberal, this is just individualist. And in my dissertation research, I found a bunch of people making these kinds of relationships out of necessity. Like, a lot of people who wanted to get into chickens and then find a mentor through Craigslist or whatever, find a mentor by buying from them, and then all of a sudden now they're their chicken mentor.
Sure.
I'd love to hear like an example or two of interactions with people you wouldn't have otherwise met that have been positive, and how you build community in a kind of mundane way.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, and that's exactly animals have been the biggest way, right? So the you know, the place that we went to get more chickens, I mean, this was literally like the 4th day after we moved out here, because we wanted more than 4. So we, you know, found a farm on Craigslist, and you know, she was selling chickens. We went to get more chickens, and you know, we ended up, like, we went to get 4 chickens. We came home with 8 chickens. You know, we spent an hour and a half talking about chicken breeds. You know, and she absolutely became a mentor. We went back for many times over the years. We bought half a pork from her. We bought other chickens from her. We, you know, looked at sheep with her when we were going to get into sheep. Absolutely leaned on her. the place we ended up buying sheep from is still the first call we make when we have a sheep question. We don't call our vet. Our vet's fine, but this person knows, not just the breed, but actually the line of genetics that our sheep are from, and everything sort of works that way. I think because people who are doing this kind of thing want to be like it's. I'm sorry, I'm not being very articulate about it. I mean, there is a greater than the transactional relationship that I think can be anchored by the transactional relationship. Despite what an economics professor might say, we aren't fundamentally economic creatures. That's just a thing that happens as a way to meet certain needs. But I think that it provides an excuse to make a broader connection. And then that connection becomes the actual thing. It may involve follow-on economic, interactions, but that's not the point. Yeah. So
and do you see that kind of model as I do? I don't know if you agree with me, as like a potential political project, a potential path towards something political. Like, and when I say political, I mean, building relationships that then become the basis for community, when they weren't explicitly trying to make community. I think like a lot of the utopian leaning people think you make community by having like a meeting about degrowth or something. That, you know what I mean? They think like you make community by having like a meeting about community, but it's like it's too self-conscious then, you know what I mean? Or like people are like, let's have a potluck, and you're like trying to like force. You've told me this before. You don't like to be at a party where it's just like you're not really sure what we're talking about, or you have to like come up with an idea. But then if you're like with somebody and working on a project, you're like, oh yeah, like this is so fun. We have something to talk about. It's the project. It's the thing, that we have to like solve together. It's so much more interesting too.
Totally. Like I identify as like shy and uninterested in talking to people, but I'm very happy to talk with people, right? I love interacting with people. I'm just not really like, I'm easily bored and don't like not knowing why we're here. So yeah. I love your vision of how that can work. If I had not even a criticism of it, but the place where I think maybe we would see it differently. And I think a lot of this is coming from the burbs and still being I drive through the burbs to get back to my house. I feel like it's a little, I wish I believed that it was as close as hearing you describe your vision makes it sound. I feel like we have a lot more pain to get through.
Yeah, no, we have so much more pain. This is just me trying to highlight the bright side, just because the doomerist side like gets so much airtime.
Yes,
I have to be like, no, there's still hope out there, but like my true self knows what's like the pain that comes in between point A and point B. Like even my own journey to Uruguay, like, oh my gosh, it's just getting set up. When we first moved into our home, we had no running water or electricity for like 3 weeks with 2 little kids. It's like, that wasn't fun, that was painful, that was hard, it was like difficult. But then I got through it, and now I feel like stronger from it. But I'm just thinking about that, that journey for people. But just trying to highlight like there's an end point to shoot for.
There is an end point, and then there is a humanity that persists along the way. It's funny, I was just thinking about your sort of theory of how this could go, and we were talking about it on this recent college visit tour, where my kid was, they're highly aware of the world, and they're definitely in the doomer phase of things. And we were driving through a neighborhood that maybe was not the one that the global capitalist machine smiles on most while we're having this conversation. And they were, sort of just expressing their lack of hope that at a systemic level, things would work out in any manner. And this neighborhood we were driving through is economically, not the best, struggling, certainly, but vibrant. You could tell, right? There was activity. There were, there were maybe shitty storefronts, but they were active. They were current. There was, it was alive. And thinking, I think a lot of you've really helped me understand how to see some of these issues. I think the interesting thing is, as the big systems fail, I mean, there are a couple of interesting things. They're not acknowledging their failure. I don't know if they know they're failing or not, but it's definitely not part of the message they project. So here they are, they control, huge chunks of our world. They're clearly failing. I think because of their unwillingness to acknowledge their failure, they're not going to stop failing, right? Like, you can't fix a problem whose existence you deny. And we all depend on them.
Right.
So they're going to fail. But I think the thing that when you reason about it only at the global level, it's easy to then think, oh, so doom and apocalypse. But if you zoom in, that's not even possible, because every person that's involved in the situation is going to wake up every day. And every day, if the system is a little bit more failing, they're still going to go do their damnedest to have a day.
Yeah.
And they're going to be creative, and they're going to, bring human ingenuity to the situation.
And they have a will to live and to survive.
Yeah.
Like, a bunch of people, everybody has a will to survive. So people figure things out. And I just think about, like, Detroit and how it's just hollowed out. And then all of a sudden there's these, like, agricultural neighborhoods, and there's just these people taking over abandoned lots and being like, this is food growing area now. I'm not going to starve, so I'm going to do this, and we're going to make it happen.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, I think a lot about the bones of a place like a downtrodden urban community. The thing I always think about is there's this in my circle of scholars, they're talking about self-sufficiency movements. And this one book I was so angry reading about, how they said something along the lines of, like, the urban poor are very good at exchange and self-sufficiency and, like, barter systems, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about new movements. And I was just like, why aren't you talking about them? Like, it's well documented that the urban poor have these systems of mutual aid, exchange, barter, and ways to get by, to cope. I'm like, this is it. This is worth looking into. And it's like, it's only interesting or valid if, like, yuppies, to put in Neil Clark's terms, yuppies are doing it, And yeah, I totally hate that. I think there's so much out there, rural and urban, and just people with less resources. In Uruguay, people are used to crisis, so they're used to having to work together and share things, and they're used to not throwing things out and reusing it and all of that. So yeah, okay. So did you have a follow-up to that?
I'm totally with you. Detroit, I think, is a fantastic example, right? It seems to be that undistributed, or that differently distributed part of our future. The thing, I guess, just on that topic, to bring us back to the doomer, the thing that really troubles me, in particular looking at the US and sort of the more traditionally privileged communities in the US, is I'm concerned about the path from here to there. Like, I have no problem imagining the post-collapse, resurgence of human ingenuity and natural community. What I'm afraid of is when we're, however many years in, to the point where the inevitability of collapse is no longer ignorable by those who are accustomed to privilege, by what they will use their power to sacrifice in order to try to cling on. And I think we see the beginning of that. And that's troubling, because I don't have a good answer to that. I just think I basically just, like, think that to me is the scariest part. It's a place where you have the least agency, like when people in power want to crush you to keep whatever power they have. Historically, not a great place to be. Under that. But so on that note, do you have a spicy take that you don't normally share on Twitter that you want to share today? This is my not today fed question. Spicy take. I don't really have any spicy takes. I think most rationality is ex post facto rationalization, in fact, and that we significantly undersell the inexplicable in our motives and even our thinking, and then we use our fancy words and our reason to make them seem true. So you believe in portents? You believe in ghosts? I don't know that I necessarily believe in ghosts. I believe there's a lot that's. I believe there's a lot that's real that we can't explain adequately. And at some point, I think that the functional difference between that and portents or magic is negligible, right? I mean, it's quibbling at some point, right? Like if, you know, I absolutely believe in science. I think that what science is missing is an appreciation of the boundaries of its lane, you know, like stay in your lane. Science, you are able to answer a certain set of questions. Theoretically, you're able to answer all the questions, but in practice, you're nowhere near that point. And you know, we don't like that, I think, because, and this is a spicy take I have shared on Twitter, so it doesn't really fit the answer. You know, I think that we have become far too dependent on being able to mechanically reduce our view of any interaction and to express it in a mechanical fashion. I think because that allows for control, right? If we can do that, if, you know, the machine has an engineer, you know, the system does not.
Right. Yeah, and I think it reminds me of what somebody was saying to me once on Twitter, that like if I asked my grandma to explain why she's doing something in the garden, I don't think she could answer the why question. Like she just does it that way. You know what I mean? And I think that there's something to that, where you spend enough time in an iterative relationship with nature. I mean, I would even say this is true for parenting. It's like this intuitive thing. It's just kind of rolling out. You're figuring it out as you go along. You see what feels right and not. And if somebody like asked me to back explain why I said something to my kid, I would be like, I'd come up with something because I just have to sound like I know what I'm doing or I have a good reason for it. But it's fully the result of like an intuitive, you know, interaction.
It is. I think there's a tricky space in here though, which is, you know, how do we like epistemologically resolve that without that turning into a blind tradition obedience? I think I'm wired somewhat deeply in an anti-authoritarian sort of manner, and for me, you know, I love my grandma, but just because she does it some way does not make that right, and her inability to explain it would, you know, set off some warning bells. It doesn't mean I wouldn't listen, right? But it does mean I wouldn't take it. It's not right just because grandma does it that way.
Yeah.
So this, I may be tipping my hand about some of the things I might disagree with certain subsets of homestead Twitter on, but yeah. I think there is, I can wholeheartedly agree with plenty of critiques of modernity and also not sign up for, you know, return as a prima facie goal. Right. I think that's frankly a little silly, only for the same reason that in the ecosystem, I would say, you know, I can't rotate the animals the same way this year because it's different. Right. You know, human society is a dynamic system as well. And so, you know, just a traditionalism as the exclusive guiding factor, I think falls far short. Yeah, now, totally. How in the world do you resolve that? I don't know. You know, I mean, it certainly involves intuition. I don't think that resolution process itself is explicable, which becomes problematic, but I think that's how it is, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so final question. I'm going to quote you back to you, something you said to me once. Self-sufficiency is not a journey, it's a journey, not a destination. It's a verb describing a state of being, not a noun describing a place. You don't get there, you become it. End quote. So my question is, do you have advice for people looking for whatever, a more connected existence, something positive to move toward? You know, how do you take those first steps? Honestly,
just go do it.
Yeah,
just go get hands on. Like that's the answer. Go, like, whatever it is. There isn't an it that's too small to be meaningful. You don't have to do it right. It doesn't matter if you do it right. I think what matters is doing it. That quote makes me cringe because obviously, you know, the same term can't be both a noun and a verb, but I think, you know, we understand the point, right? Like the intention is, it is more about being a state than a destination, and that I think is right. But yeah, I think the advice is go get your hands dirty.
Yeah, and also find other people doing it, like, because there's always some. Yeah. There's so many people in the world. There's always some weirdo who likes the thing you like. If it's like, you know, forging metal or something, whatever it is, you'll find some other weird person who likes that and wants to teach you or whatever.
And the internet is good for that, right?
Yeah.
It may be destroying our civilization as we speak, but it is also really good at letting you find a similar weirdo, which is a wonderful, wonderful property.
Trace, do you have a final question for Josh?
I do not. I've been the super weirdo kind of creeping at the edges here, listening to everything. No, this is an amazing conversation. Thank y'all so much for having it.
All right, so
It's
Josh,
super fun.
we're gonna follow our normal tradition of cutting off the podcast in the middle of somebody's sentence. So I'm gonna let you have the last sentence.
I mean, before you do that, there's just one critical thing that everybody needs to understand, and that is